Thank you, Leo. It's an enormous honor to follow Ernest Green, who I consider, and many people consider, a true American hero for integrating the Little Rock Public Schools. I'm also a big fan of your work on the assistance program integrating the building trades with Bayard Rustin, which is another important chapter. But I'm delighted to be on the panel with you, and also my good friends John, Mike, and Lonnie. There unfortunately is a intimate community that continues to fight for school integration. So we all know each other. I hope that a panel like this will help broaden the circle of those individuals. So as we make the transition from American hero to geek, I will use the PowerPoint to outline what I want to try to say in my period of time here. So I really want to try to address two big questions. The first is why we should bother with integration. Almost none of the education reform effort is focused on this. It's all about trying to make high-poverty schools work better. So why should we care about integration? And secondly, talk about some of the practical steps that school districts can take, and school districts are taking, to integrate schools today. Most of these with a primary emphasis on socioeconomic status as well as race. So, so the first question is why bother with integration? So we are marking the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education this year. And there's been a lot of discussion of the meaning of Brown. But it's striking to me that almost all the discussions avoid the actual issue of school integration. So Brown has become this metaphor for, a vague metaphor for equal opportunity, which all of us are for, but avoids grappling with the fact that our schools are deeply segregated by race and socioeconomic status. And I want to suggest that that's a problem. Just to depart from the PowerPoint for a second, many of you saw there was a decision handed down in the Vergara case yesterday in California, in which, once again, Brown was invoked in the first line of the decision. And the court was grappling with a genuine problem, which is that low-income and minority students tend to get the weakest teachers. All the research backs that up, and it's a concern for most people. But then rather than suggesting the remedy would be to desegregate the schools so that teachers would be attracted to schools throughout districts, but they wouldn't need to avoid high poverty schools that we know teachers do. Instead, there's an assault on union rights and the protections that unions have fought for teachers. And to me, that's a complete bastardization of Brown. I mean, Ernie, you were talking about the alliance between teachers and Thurgood Marshall and fighting together for more integrated schools and fairness. And it seems to me that a decision like Vergara upends that entire principle. Okay, so back to why should we care about integration? There is a half century of research to suggest that concentrations of poverty, which are closely related to racial segregation, are hugely problematic in terms of equal opportunity. So kind of the granddaddy of education research is the Coleman Report from 1966, which found that the biggest predictor of academic achievement is the socioeconomic status of the family that a child comes from. The second biggest predictor was the socioeconomic status of the school that she attends. that concentrations of poverty have a separate and negative, additional negative effect for students. So poor kids face a double whammy. It's a disadvantage to be born into a poor family, and then when we segregate schools such that poor kids don't get a chance to be in integrated and economically integrated environments, they face a second independent disadvantage. And since this is the Albert Shanker Institute, I'll just mention that, Al Shanker fought for this issue too, that he talked about the Coleman Report and the need to integrate schools, and was one of the early proponents of magnet schools. All of us know that there are some high poverty schools that work out there, and I think we applaud those efforts to make high poverty schools work better. But the odds are overwhelmingly against children in high poverty schools. So middle class schools, those with more than 50% of students not eligible for free and reduced price lunch, are about 22 times as likely to be high performing as high poverty schools, which in that study was defined as more than 50% low income. Now, part of that's because low-income kids come to school less prepared, but there's a separate effect that is associated with the segregation of schools itself. So in this figure, the top line are the scores of the middle-class students on the 4th grade National Assessment for Educational Progress. The bottom line is the low-income students. And you can see that both sets of students do better in more affluent schools than in high-poverty schools. And indeed, low-income kids who get a chance to go to low-poverty schools are actually scoring higher on the NAEP than middle-class kids who are stuck in high-poverty schools. So maybe there's something about the concentrations of poverty themselves that are problematic. Now, some people will look at this figure and say, well, yeah, but who are those low-income families that fight their way into low-poverty schools? Maybe there's something special about the motivation of those families. But there's a study, an important study, that the Century Foundation released a couple of years ago by Heather Schwartz of RAND, looking at Montgomery County public schools. And what was important about the study is the students were essentially randomly assigned to public housing units throughout Montgomery County, which most of you here in the audience at least know is right outside of Washington, D.C., and includes affluent areas and includes low-income areas as well. And Montgomery County is a progressive place, and so they spend more money per pupil on the higher poverty schools, about $2,000 more. So when students were assigned, or families were assigned to public housing units throughout the county, the question is, where would you be better off? Would you be better off if you went to a school that spent more money but had higher concentrations of poverty, or a school that spent somewhat less but had lower levels of poverty in the school? And here's what Dr. Schwartz found. The kids in the green zone schools, that is the more affluent schools, over time scored quite a bit higher on, these are math figures here, than those students in the red zone schools, the higher poverty schools. So these are all kids who are quite poor. They're in public housing, and they were well, almost all of them took whatever opportunity they could have because public housing is scarce, and so essentially randomly assigned. The progress for the low-income kids in the low-poverty schools was remarkable. They were able to close the math and reading scores by considerable levels, and the other thing to note is that much of the progress was based on the fact that they had access to integrated schools as opposed to neighborhoods. There was a bonus. There was about a third of the positive effect was living in a middle-class neighborhood, but 2/3 had to do with schooling per se. What about the effect on the middle-class kids? Well, there's lots of research on the national level to suggest that there's no negative effect on middle-class kids to integrating schools by economic status. particularly when there's a majority of those students are middle class. And at the same time, there is a growing body of research to suggest that all students benefit from diversity, economic and racial diversity. That if you want to be prepared to work in the 21st century workforce, you need to be able to get along with people of all different backgrounds, and that the most creative solutions are found when people bring different life experiences to the table. And so there are all sorts of benefits as well. People then often ask, well, why should it matter whether your classmates are rich or poor? And the way I like to think about it is that there are three sets of actors in a school, and that it's an advantage to be in a economically integrated school rather than a high poverty school, related to those three factors. There are students, your classmates, there are teachers and principals, and there are parents who are part of the larger school community. So if you think first about students, it's an advantage to be in a school where your peers are going to have a positive influence. Every parent knows this, and there's lots of research to back it up as well. It's an advantage to be in a school where there are lower levels of student disorder. That happens more in that positive environment happens more often in economically integrated schools than in high poverty schools. It's good to be in a stable environment where kids are not constantly moving in and out of the classroom because their parents have to change apartments. And the mobility rates are much higher in high poverty schools than in middle class schools. And finally, there is an advantage to being around high achieving peers. To give you one concrete example, Coleman and others have found that it's an advantage to be in an environment where your peers have larger vocabularies because you're going to access more language that way. And in middle-class schools, on average, the students have much larger vocabularies than in high-poverty schools. There's a lot of research to suggest parental involvement improves schools, and that it's an advantage to be in a school where parents are actively engaged. But we know from research that middle-class parents are about 4 times as likely to be PTA members, about twice as likely to volunteer in the class. Now I want to pause and say I'm not blaming low-income parents for lower levels of parental involvement. If you're working several jobs, if you don't have flexibility in the hours that you work, if you don't have a car to get to the PTA meeting, it makes sense that you may not be as actively involved. But nevertheless, it's an advantage for a poor kid to be in a school where some parents are involved, and that's much more likely to happen in economically mixed schools than in high poverty schools. And the final piece is the teachers. Oops, I went too far. As I was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of research to suggest that the strongest teachers end up in middle-class and economically mixed schools and avoid high-poverty schools. Mike, I think you had a line in your book that essentially we bring in fresh teachers, new inexperienced teachers, and they train themselves on poor kids and then move to middle-class schools. So that's a concern. We could try to bribe teachers to go to high-quality teachers to go to high-poverty schools. Research by Eric Hanyasek suggests that the bribe would have to be quite high, in the order of 40% to get experienced teachers to stay in high-poverty schools. So what can be done? Well, there are a number of school districts who are now trying a new approach to integration that is different than kind of the stereotype of what we saw in Boston in the 1970s, where there was compulsory busing for racial desegregation. And that was really meant as a remedy for past discrimination, past and current discrimination, which was totally appropriate at the time. But today, the integration programs are really aimed at, they're really an education reform strategy. They tend to focus on socioeconomic status as much as race, and they tend to emphasize choice and incentives and magnet schools because the compulsory nature of busing really didn't work. So there are two reasons that socioeconomic integration is now the primary focus of a number of districts. One is legal. The conservative Supreme Court has, over time, constrained the ability of school districts to use race. They have not completely eliminated it, but they've made it more difficult. And there is no problem with using socioeconomic status and student assignment. Roberts, Alito, Scalia, they won't go after socioeconomic status. So that's part of the reason the districts are shifting. The other reason is that the social science research has always suggested that the problems that arise in school are not associated with race per se, but rather with concentrations of poverty. That is, African American students did better in white schools, not because of something about the whiteness of the skin color of the classmates, but rather because, on average, white students came from more economically advantaged families and could provide the positive influences that I talked about before. And John, I just want to quote you. One of the great things about the chef case that John pioneered is that it went after both concentrations of poverty and race. And John told the New York Times a number of years ago, the most signal fact about Hartford is not that it's 92% non-white, but that it's 63% poor. So from an educational standpoint, that's important. Now, I think most of us, probably all of us on the panel, also would like to see schools that are racially integrated. But given the unfortunate association between race and class in our society, socioeconomic integration will often translate into that positive racial integration. And I'll mention here that Elaine Weiss at the Economic Policy Institute has a terrific new study on the association between race and class and the way in which African American students, in particular, are stuck in these high poverty schools. Okay, so there are now about 80 school districts across the country that are educate about 4 million students and are focusing on socioeconomic status. To give you a couple of examples, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, they seek to balance all their schools, all of which are magnet schools, by socioeconomic status, looking at the free and reduced price lunch. They do it through choice. There are, if a school is unattractive, they will place a positive pedagogical approach in there and try to make it more attractive. In Hartford also, where John's been doing great work, they've been able to successfully attract white and middle-class families from the suburbs to attend magnet schools in Hartford, some located in very distressed neighborhoods, because what's at the end of the bus ride or the car ride is a really positive integrated education. We've seen some positive effects in Cambridge, for example. You can see Black and Latino and low-income students are graduating at much higher rates than they are in Boston and that they are in Massachusetts as a whole, and the white kids are continuing to do well. The last thing I'll say is that this will take organizing. It's not easy. Wake County, North Carolina, which has one of the largest socioeconomic integration plans, ran into some political troubles a couple of years ago when the Tea Party got involved with the school board. But the good news was that there are a number of groups that were galvanized in Wake County to reinsert the goal of integrated schools. So you had the business community that saw that their employees needed to get along with one another, and so they wanted integrated schools. And they knew that integrated schools were more likely to produce high-achieving students. Faith groups, civil rights groups, magnet school parents, and others all came together, and most importantly, teachers. Teachers know, on the front line, know that it is easier to do their job when they are in an integrated classroom than if they're in a high-poverty classroom, and so have been strong supporters of integration. My concluding thought, and I always say this, even though maybe it shouldn't be necessary, is my whole point is that poor kids can do great things if given the right environment. Because some people, when they hear me talking about concentrations of poverty, think that I'm arguing the opposite. And in fact, we know that in Montgomery County and elsewhere, if given that integrated environment, kids can do wonderful things. And I'm hoping that this anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education will be an occasion for us to readjust the debate. 95% of education reform is about making Plessy, separate but equal, work. That's Arne Duncan's agenda. And it's the agenda of almost all of education reform. And the efforts being made are important, but I think we need more balance in the discussion so that we address this question of economic segregation itself. Thanks.
Thank you.